None of us are an island to ourselves. In our hyper-individualistic culture, where one of the primary virtues is looking out for yourself, prioritizing your own well-being, prioritizing your own success and victory. What we see in this commandment is we are told to do the opposite.
Drama has followed the Ten Commandments since the beginning. God himself spoke from the top of Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning. The commandments are the only part of Scripture that God himself physically wrote. Down through the ages, the commandments have been the benchmark of morality in Judeo-Christian thought, and today, the displaying of the commandments continues to be a source of controversy and drama. But what are the commandments? These 10 rules important enough for God to personally deliver. Join us on this 12-part journey through the commandments that form the bedrock for what following Christ looks like.
Welcome back to our series on the Ten Commandments. We're going to continue on here with a brief pause for a review, mostly just reminding us of the two lenses that we're looking through these commandments with. The first lens comes from Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, the Shema, which reads, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. Therefore, love the Lord your God, to love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your muchness." Again, we talked about this in our first episode, and basically, it comes down to the idea that loving Yahweh looks like obeying him absolutely. The second lens is the second greatest commandment that Jesus talked about, and this originally comes from Leviticus chapter 19, and it goes, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And as we discussed when we examine Leviticus 19 in its context, our neighbor is the disadvantaged among us. It's the person who is weaker than us, the person we have power over. And so loving them looks like taking care of them, even sometimes at the expense of ourselves. Back to our commandment series, we're on the fifth commandment here, and this is either your favorite or least favorite commandment, depending on how old you are and whether or not you have kids. Now, if you're under 16 watching this, you probably hate this commandment. It's probably been used to browbeat you into doing something you maybe didn't want to do. Now, if you're a parent, this may be a commandment that you've gotten a little too much mileage out of in lording it over your kids. And the commandments found, of course, in two places, as are all 10 commandments. The first in Exodus 20, verse 12, and the other is in Deuteronomy 5:16. In Exodus we read, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which Yahweh your God is giving you." The Deuteronomy version is largely similar, reading, "Honor your father and mother, as Yahweh your God commanded you, that your days may be long, and that it may go well with you in the land Yahweh your God is giving you." As Paul notes in Ephesians, this is the first commandment, and only one of the 10, with a promise. And along with the fourth commandment, and these two do go hand in hand very often, these are the only two positive commands. In other words, they are telling us what to do rather than telling us what not to do, which should be a negative command. But of course, as we're listening to this, and parents getting ready to tell your kids how to behave, hold off on that. Because I want you to think carefully about the words. An astute reader will, of course, have several important questions, such as, what is honor? What does it mean to honor one's parents? Why does this commandment have a promise, especially the promise of living long in the land? Offhand, it seems like the very next commandment, do not kill or do not commit murder, would much more sensibly lead to long life in the land. After all, if we're going around killing each other, we're not going to stick around very long. But that's not how God chose to word things. Instead, he gave this command, specifically, the promise of a long life. So to answer these questions, let's dive in. Now, there are several parallel commandments to this in the Torah. The idea of honoring your parents, respecting your parents, giving them fealty actually comes up a lot. And it's going to highlight two key words that help us understand this commandment. The first word is kavod, the second word is kalal, and these are antonyms of each other. I'm going to read off a few verses for you, a few passages for you that talk about loving or honoring one's parents. Leviticus 19:3 says, for example, "Every one of you shall revere or fear his mother and father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths." Note that these two commandments are again tied together. "For I am Yahweh your God." Exodus 21:15 commands, "Whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death." It's pretty straightforward. Back to Leviticus, and this time in chapter 20, verse 9, we read, "For anyone who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. For he has cursed his father or mother, his blood is upon him," or her. Jesus, of course, referenced this command in the discussion with the Pharisees about their selective keeping of the Torah in Mark 7, 1 through 13. And finally, in Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21, there's a law detailing that a son or daughter who is rebellious and gluttonous, such an offspring is to be stoned to death. Now, if there are any kids listening to this and hearing these commands about talking back to your parents resulting in the death penalty, might be a bit uncomfortable here. And certainly these are draconian laws by modern standards. I mean, in many places we're not allowed to spank our children. Stoning them is way beyond the pale. Now, clearly I'm not advocating that we stone our children or even spank them or anything like that. But it is clear that a proper relationship between children and parents is extremely important. This is something we probably don't understand in our modern context. We're going to come back to that. But first we're going to consider the words here for a bit. So the words used throughout these laws: honor, fear, obey. Now these are words that anyone who's read the Old Testament in any sort of meaningful way will recognize that are applied to one's relationship with God. We are to honor God. We'll talk more about this word here in a moment. We are to fear God, to obey God. Note that the word for obey is the same as the word for hear. It's the word Shema, which you will, of course, remember as the name of the first and greatest commandment, the Shema, which starts with the word in Hebrew, Shema. It goes Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, or obey, O Israel. We talked about this in our first episode. All right. These are all words that apply to parents that are also applied to one's relationship with God. Now let's discuss the first of these words, kavod, which is what is used in the commandment here to honor one's parents, kavod, your parents, which carries the significance, the basic meaning, the most at core meaning of the word is simply weight or heaviness. And then it's, of course, used metaphorically to mean honor and a few other ways that we're going to talk about here. A quick example of how it is used. In 2 Samuel, the word is used to describe how much Absalom's hair weighs when it was cut. Now, this is a term that can also be used for oppression. For example, in Judges chapter 1, verse 35, the Israelites are described as being heavy or weighty or oppressive on the Amorites who are still living in the land, forcing them essentially into slavery. In Psalms 38:5, the psalmist writes that their sin is too heavy, kavod, for them to bear. Now, this context should help us understand what the word on or what the concept of honor is. It means giving weight and priority to the object of heaviness or honor. An example of improper honoring or improper weight is Eli, who honored his sons or gave weight to his sons above God, according to 1 Samuel 2:29. In Malachi chapter 1, God complains that his people have not properly honored him by their offerings, by offering second and even third-rate sacrifices. In other words, they have not prioritized God. They have not given God weight. Similarly, this word also is used to describe value, often when it is tied to wealth. For example, in Genesis chapter 13, verse 2, it records that Abraham was heavy, weighty, with livestock, gold, and silver. Now, certainly this was quite literally true. He had a significant amount of weight of all of those. But really what it means is he had a lot of valuable items. He was wealthy. So for people to be honored, then, it is to be valued. Okay? You have a rich person has heavy wealth, gold, silver, animals. Okay? So when I kavod somebody, I am treating them as if they have great wealth, great value in character or relationship or whatever. So for example, David honored, kavod, Benaniah, one of his mighty warriors in 2 Samuel 23:23, by setting him over his bodyguard. In other words, he showed Benaniah that he was valued, or at least his military prowess was valued. Now, the second word I want to look at is the opposite, and that's kalal, which is used in Exodus 21, verse 17, and Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9, which means to curse. And this is what the rebellious or improper child does to earn the death penalty. Like the base meaning of kavod, which is to be heavy, the base meaning of kalal is to be light, Again, it's the antonym of kavod. Consequently, it carries the connotation of insignificance. Job, for example, calls himself kalal, light, when he says, I am of small account in Job chapter 40, verse 4. When offered the hand of Saul's daughter twice, or two different daughters, it's a very long, weird story, David used silver language to describe himself. He says, I am kalal, I am light, I'm meaningless, in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Since heavy is associated with value, light, not light, but lack of weight, is associated with that which lacks value. Light also can then mean contemptible. For example, Hagar showed kalal to Sarah. She treated Sarah with contempt, with lightness, in Genesis chapter 16. Now, it should be noted that there is a magical component to kalal. Again, to curse somebody. When we think of curse, there is a magical component to that. The Leviticus command to not curse one's parents is in the context of prohibiting the use of magic. As with the idea of blessing, to curse carried real tangible force. They believed magic was a very real thing, or what we would consider magic. For example, Balaam was called to kalal, curse, make light, Israel by King Balak of Moab. Of course, God wouldn't let him do this. There was a talking donkey involved. It was a whole deal. But the point of this is that Balak believed that Balaam's kalals, his curses, would have a real tangible effect that would harm the Israelites. And God seemed to think so as well by going out of his way, making a donkey talk and all, to make sure that Balaam didn't, in fact, speak those curses. So when the Bible speaks of cursing someone's parents, especially in Leviticus, it is not simply prohibiting talking back to them, although I'm not saying that's okay. It is about actively seeking their harm. So to summarize, the command about honoring one's parents revolves around two opposite ideas. First, to honor one's parents is to treat them as heavy, i.e. significant, the priority, and valuable. We treat them much like, although not to the same level, as we treat God. We respect them, we obey them, although again, as Jesus would add nuance to in Luke chapter 14, we don't place them above God. Parents are our second priority behind God. Well, that's all well and good. Okay, and that simply makes sense. It's actually one of the more straightforward to apply commandments. Treat your parents with value. Treat your family with value. Honor them by obeying them. Okay, that seems to make sense. And obviously, don't actively seek their harm. But to truly understand the depths of this commandment, we have to understand what this commandment is saying within the context of the social structure of ancient Israel, which is very different from our own. Today, when we think of the most basic social unit in existence, it's the individual. Each of us have our own social security number. We live as individual, distinct entities. And for most of us, we go out on our own. We live single lives where we build our own lives for ourselves, quite separate and distinct from our parents, even within marriages in modern times. And we'll talk a little bit more about marriage in a couple of commandments. But people are encouraged to maintain their own individuality within the relationship. And there's, I think, some sage advice there. But again, that's all based on the premise that the most basic social identifying unit in society is the individual. But that is not the case for the ancient Israelites or the entire ancient Near East. In their society, the most basic social unit was the family, really the nuclear family of a mom, a dad, and children, with the dad serving as the head patriarch of the family, wielding close to absolute power. So when we think about this, now the term for this, by the way, is called a Beit Av, or house of the father. It's been fairly well researched, and we can actually document this even archaeologically as well, although there's some nuance that would need to be added to fully understand this concept. I'm oversimplifying things here. But in this Beit Av context, okay, you exist as part of a larger social unit. If you remove yourself from your Beit Av, you don't really exist as a person. All right? You don't exist as an independent social unit. Your existence, your survival, your legal standing is dependent on your connection to a Beit Av. To really understand, a good way of looking at this would be to study the story of Ruth, which we're not going to get into today. Maybe we'll save that for a later episode, or for another episode in a different series. But the story of Ruth shows us how vital it was to be connected to family. It's why Ruth ultimately marries Boaz in the end. It wasn't for romance or love, unfortunately, as nice of a story as that would be. It's because that Ruth and Naomi needed to be married into an existing family, an existing Beit Av, to exist. Your family is what gave you your identity, your social standing, your social protection. It's what gave you your economic protection, your economic standing. It provided you physical protection, both from the elements, from animals, pretty much everything. Everything was dependent on being part of a family. And so how this would usually work is you would have the patriarch, the father, you'd have the mother who would be there as well. Then you'd have the children, right? And the children, of course, would be under the rule of the father. Now, in many cases, this would be multi-generational, where you would have the grandfather as the patriarch above it all, with the grandmother as the matriarch, and then you would have the children, the sons, who would then have, and their wives and their children under the grandfather, under the head patriarch. Now, when that patriarch dies, each of those sons now forms their own distinct Beit Avs. Okay? And within those Beit Avs, they provide their children with their wives, their social standing, their existence in society. Okay? So that is the base. That again, that's an oversimplification. That's basically how it worked. Now, this would then expand out. Those three individual Beit Avs that we just described, let's say three sons here of the head patriarch who's now passed. Those three Beit Avs together are still connected by blood. They are still family with each other. They're still very close, and they form a clan. And they have cousins who have their own clans, and those clans together eventually form a tribe, and so on and so forth. So the basic structure is Beit Av, the nuclear family, the clan, the tribe. Note, it does not start with the person. So family is paramount. It provides everything. And family is ultimately defined in the father. And Scripture, the way Scripture words it, really in both parents, in the father and the mother. And so your parents are a stand-in for your family. So when you read this commandment, it would be another way of reading this would be honor your family. Okay? Now, if you do that, if you give weight and priority to your family, if you give deference to your family, if you treat your family in this socioeconomic context, okay, as having great value, great importance, great weight, okay, we can start to see how this would lead to people living long in the land. But you can also see how it might lead to blood feuds and a lot of violence, and it does, but we're going to set that aside for the moment. Instead, you can see how if everybody chipping in because they prioritize the well-being of the whole, of the family, above their own individual well-being, you can see how this would then create a healthy environment for everybody in that family. Everybody's taken care of. Okay? So that's why this has that promise. It's almost just a logical conclusion. You take care of your family. You set aside your own ambitions, your own personal gain for the well-being of the collective whole of your family. Then, consequently, the family will take care of you. And if the family takes care of you as you take care of the family, well, that's how you live long in this socioeconomic context. Now, I want to keep in mind, I'm not saying we should just one-to-one transpose this idea into our world because it doesn't work. We don't live that way. Our most basic social unit is not the family, it's the individual. And we have to operate within that context. Okay? So that's an important point. That's an important point to keep in mind. And as we're going to see, God is not telling us that this particular way, which was culturally conditioned by the culture around us, this is not something that God prescribed. Okay? This is simply the way the society worked. Okay? So this idea of saying, individuals don't exist, and pretending within our churches that individuals don't exist and only families, well, that's not how our society works. Okay? And God is not telling us that that's how society ought to work. Rather, God is saying within the context of this societal structure, this is how you ought to operate to follow me. Okay? Again, as we said, There's a deep level of interconnectedness in these family relationships that expand out. Again, related Be'avs form clans, related clans form tribes, so on and so forth. And really, a tribe is generally considered the largest unit, although you have, again, supra-tribal organizations like Israel, which are confederations of these individual tribal families, usually united by religion or language or some combination thereof, or mutual interests of defense. Again, this idea of family is so important that it's the language that is used in diplomacy and kingship. For example, kings are seen as the patriarch of a massive Be'av. So in other words, they take this idea of that super tribal organization, so let's say Israel as a collective whole, the collection of the 12 tribes. When they appoint a king, that king is now the patriarch of the entire Be'av of Israel. Okay? And in international relationships, we do the same thing. When in international correspondence, a suzerain calls his vassal his son, and a vassal calls his suzerain his father. Meanwhile, kings who are on the same level, peers, call each other brother. So again, it's important to understand, survival as an individual in this socioeconomic context simply wasn't possible. You needed your family to survive, and your family needed you. This is where the idea of like the gluttonous and rebellious son earning the death penalty, well, we still would say it's far too draconian for our tastes. We can at least understand it a little bit more. If one person in this Be'av decides to just go off and do their own thing, being a glutton, so stealing the family resources, excessively taking family food and resources, that is taking from everybody else. That person is not simply just being annoying. That person is representing a clear and present danger to the survival of the rest of the Be'av, if not the clan. And so to dishonor one's parents, to dishonor one's family, to treat one's family as insignificant and light, has real practical consequences, deadly consequences in some cases, for the rest of the family and the rest of the clan and perhaps the rest of the town. Dismissing your family, deciding to break with the societal structure because you want to do some things your own way, that has deadly consequences. And so as we consider this commandment, it's important to remember that what this commandment is really driving at. None of us are an island to ourselves. In our hyper-individualistic culture, where one of the primary virtues is looking out for yourself, prioritizing your own well-being, prioritizing your own success and victory. What we see in this commandment is we are told to do the opposite. In many ways, I would argue that to honor our parents, which we should do quite literally, and again, this commandment in many respects is quite easy to apply literalistically. Just treat your parents as worthy. Treat your family as meaningful, as significant. But it's important to remember that we are not islands, as much as we like to think that we are. What we do has real, tangible consequences on other people. Okay? When I buy something in the store, there's a whole chain of operations that gets those things to me. So, am I helping people or am I hurting people by that purchase? It is to treat our society, the people that we live in society with, as meaningful and valuable. It is to take the society, the social circles that we live in seriously. And we can look at this as our family. This can be our town, our neighborhood. It can be our church family. It can be our country. And again, it's not to value these institutions as supreme. We've already talked about why that's not okay. But it is to value the people that make them up as meaningful and important. It is to understand that what we do has real consequences to everyone else. No matter how much we think we are individuals and we can do whatever we want and it only affects us. The truth is, nothing we do really only ever affects us. Everything we do has real consequences to other people around us. Some greater, some lesser, some more obvious than others. And so in the end, as we close, what this commandment is telling us to treat with weight, to give real weight and significance to, is not just our parents, although we should. Not just our immediate family, although we should. but to the societies that we live in, to the people around us that we affect on a daily basis by every choice, every action, every thought that we have. And so as we close, may you feel the weight of the world around you. May you feel the weight of the people around you and treat them with the value that they deserve. And may you not treat them as nothing.